Okay. Thanks so much for coming for another session of the CPAD's conference held over 2 days, yesterday and today, and it's great to have you all. Leonardo Skipit from the Austrian Academy of Sciences, Roba Al-Hassani, Roba Ali Al-Hassani, Al-Hassani. Do massively apologize. Feel free to correct me on that. So it's
Al-Hassani.
Al-Hassani. Perfect.
Yeah, the double S is confusing.
This is perfect. That's great. Thanks for correcting me. What am I start for the panel? It's great to have Roba. Our Roba joined CPAD as a postdoc, exactly like what I do. Rashid Boutayeb coming from the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. So I want to just check. The floor is yours, and sorry about that. Just it's getting very bit confusing here, so I'm looking for the. Sorry about that. Things are freezing up, so sorry. If you just give me 1 second, or actually, in that case, because it's really sad that we would lose Leonardo because he has an urgent appointment. So what we do is actually we'll start with Leonardo and then move to Roba and then Rashid. And it's a great Luciano Zakara is joining us from the Qatar University. It's great to have you as well. So we'll start with Leonardo, Roba, Rashid, and then Luciano on that. Please, the floor is yours, and thanks for coming, Leonardo, on that.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Is it okay for the other members too? I'm very sorry that I really wanted to hear. This is being recorded, so I'm hoping that I'm gonna be able to hear you all back later. So again, very, very sorry for this. And without further ado, in 2007, a group of 117 Palestinian refugees moved from Iraq to Brazil following a resettlement plan involving the UNHCR, the Brazilian government, and civil society, including international NGOs. This presentation discusses the resettlement plan of this group of refugees, highlighting the experiences of both refugees and local established Arab diaspora around the idea of citizenship. An important component of the Brazilian development project during the Workers' Party years, the PT government, had been to increase visibility in international politics. This new international orientation demanded humanitarian action. So this resettlement plan discussed here unfolded within this larger context, and more specifically, that of Brazil's interest in securing a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. I will argue that Brazilian social actors treated the refugees as migrants and expected them to integrate, just as previous Arab migrants had integrated in the early 20th century. So in a Jordanian refugee camp, these Palestinian refugees had already developed a reputation for being undesirable and unfit for refuge elsewhere, even in comparison to other local refugees. Through this double rejection, I discussed the principles of integration and tutelage, both intimately tied to citizenship. Discussing the role of citizenship in this process, in turn, enables us to access the way the Brazilian nation state navigated these political meanders and question broad assumptions about humanitarianism. Michel Agier had noted that the world's refugees are undesirable. He states, and then a quotation, "They are at the end of the day undesirable, kept apart from the world, far from the city. They are the very figure of a detestable liminality." End quotation. Yet, the following story concerns a slightly different category of people. For the group coming from Iraq was actually branded outcasts among such undesirables. So the resettled Palestinians left Iraq for Brazil during the war. Among them, there were men, women, and children of all ages. Many of the adults worked for the Iraqi government bureaucracy, at least at some point. Prior to coming to Brazil, almost all of them were temporarily lodged in Rawashid, a refugee camp in the Jordanian desert close to the border with Iraq. There, they had already developed a reputation for being undesirable and unfit for refuge elsewhere, even in comparison to other local refugees. They were among the last to find refuge prior to the camp's closure. Once in Brazil, they were again deemed undesirable, only this time due primarily to a mythical national narrative. This double rejection of being outcast among undesirables has worked against these Palestinians' perceived integration. Through the lenses of this double rejection, I discussed then the principles of integration and tutelage, putting the supposed apolitical character of humanitarianism into perspective, and showing how mythical ideological notions of Brazilianness also help to reinforce and reproduce stereotypes associated with Palestinians. So after the fall of Saddam Hussein, many refugee camps started to form in Iraq. These camps received refugee groups of diverse ethnicities and religions and vulnerable due to various political reasons, all of which were connected to the demise of Saddam Hussein's regime in 2003. The refugees were Sunni, Shia, and Christian Iraqis. They were also Iranians, Kurds, Sudanese, and Palestinians, among other minorities historically living in Iraq at the time of the war. Rawashid was located in the Jordanian desert, close to the Iraqi border, and thus under Jordanian jurisdiction. The camp there was created in 2003, specifically to receive refugees from all other camps and to serve as a transitional point between Iraq and the resettlement countries. In 2007, the UNHCR aimed at closing Rawashid and resettling all of its population. For this institution, resettlement entails permanent residency in a country other than that of the refuge. The group of Palestinians who landed in Brazil was the last to leave Rawashid before the camp was deactivated. The humanitarian agents frequently spoke to me of the resettlement project as a favor. The benefit was not inclusion through national citizenship at first, but protraction through tutelage, which in turn implies the non-recognition of the autonomy of the subjected, who become then objects of the humanitarian policies. In this model, there are those who are eternally recipients and those who are eternally givers. Consequently, the relationship between the terms is always unilinearly asymmetrical, as the recipients are always bound to the giver's favors. Accordingly, once in Brazil, the Rawashid group discovered that Brazilian citizenship was not unconditional, automatic, and uninterested. It was rather something that they would have to deserve in the eyes of the Brazilian government. Far from a gift, the logic was closer to the Weberian Protestant ethics, a prize given only to those who are able to demonstrate their successful efforts to integrate, overcoming inherent difficulties. What integration meant, however, was very elusive. In theory, integration loosely meant to be able to fit Brazilian society, and almost every resettlement agent had an opinion on the matter. In practice, the Brazilian government officially decided who would become integrated and thus who deserved to gain permanent status in Brazil on an individual basis grounded on relative criteria, such as personal sympathies, and especially the display of non-confrontational behavior towards the resettlement agents. The project itself and all levels of the Brazilian authority and bureaucracy. Nevertheless, a discourse recognizing the authoritative character of the tutelage did not always accompany the tutelary intervention. In fact, tutelage often came bound to a critical discourse against the vulnerability of the refugees. The group of Palestinian refugees in question was constructed by the Brazilian government as objects of tutelage because they were restricted not only by extrinsic war impositions, for instance, territorial mobility, but also because they were supposedly incapable of understanding it and thus choosing what was best for them. Accordingly, what the refugees were incapable of conceiving of in first place was the Brazilian state's heroic act of saving them from the catastrophe that had undercut their lives. These Palestinians were thus incapable of judging that their coming to Brazil was a unique opportunity, given the multicultural tradition of the Brazilian nation and the competence of the state in its treatment of immigrants. In an interview with one of the Brazilian state's top representatives, I also heard that, that's a quotation, in Brazil, those who do not integrate are only those who choose not to, end of quotation. Such integration was related to the Brazilian long tradition, supposedly, of receiving immigrants, and therefore the non-integration of the Palestinians was an abnormality associated with limitations, social, political, ethnic, religious, or cultural, intrinsic to them and dissociated from the resettlement program or the Brazilian context. However, the concept of integration, as I said, proved to be very elusive. The criteria could not be found in any text of law or even in any of the institution's brochures, websites, or any other form of official discourse. They were not evident or transparent, and the decision was on an individual basis and dependent on the Brazilian government's commissary's judgment. So Rwasian refugees constantly reiterated their unawareness of the conditional character of their Brazilian citizenship. The very move to Brazil and the subsequent integration into the Brazilian nation were imposed on the Rwasian group. Once in Brazil, each refugee had to tackle the Brazilian context in one or another way, either by trying exile or seeking integration. By conditioning citizenship on integration and by informally associating integration with both civic duties and cultural expectations, the Brazilian state's integration efforts were instead often perceived by the refugees as assimilation and or obedience to all forms of authority to which they were subjected. These undesirables then went to Brazil because no other country accepted them, and they only went there because the decision was imposed on them. The humanitarian discourse not only qualified these refugees as being capable of autonomous decision, but also denied them the right to desire, for example, to be sent to another country, or to resent the humanitarian agents, for example, for sending them to Brazil. In practice, the refugees could not even choose to remain in Rwasian, as a few supposedly had preferred. The refugees' ideas about Brazil contrasted greatly with the state's own official narrative, which was based on a mythical, heroic description of the nation, of its potentialities, and its natural and social riches. Among the promises made and not granted by the UNHCR in Brazil, the refugees placed one above all others, citizenship, which in this sense represented more than just simple chart of common rights and duties. It represented belonging to the Brazilian nation. Nationality via citizenship is the only possibility of becoming a subject in the contemporary national order of the world, to use Lisa Malki's words. In practice, even the humanitarian agents presuppose that the human, in the plenitude of its rights and duties, and thus beyond tutelage, is only imaginable within the parameters of the nation state. This view assumes the ineluctable political condition of the subject. However, this is also precisely what the humanitarian discourse denies by upholding the assumption that it is beyond politics and thus beyond ideology. More commonly, the humanitarian discourse is thought of in terms of an ideological liberal notion of universal human rights associated with a politics of commitment to the just protection of those rights. However, they claim to transcend politics or the particular interest of nation states and other political actors constitutes the very substance of humanitarian politics. And by claiming universality then, the humanitarian discourse also claims to be beyond ideology. This universal pretension serves to legitimize humanitarian in both ideological and political terms. The perlocutionary effects of this denial of particularism, politics, and ideology are vast and manifest. For instance, it precludes the possibility of self-criticism and of being put in perspective. Being beyond politics and ideology essentially entails an ontological, out-of-the-world position beyond perspectives. Consequently, problems, whenever they exist, are always located elsewhere, usually in the object of tutelage or in the not-so-partial host institutions. So while the resettlement agents took for granted that the locals closest to the refugees would be other Palestinians and Arabs, the relationship between these groups proved to be less than harmonious. In addition, the UNHCR entrusted its responsibility to local humanitarian NGOs who responded directly to Brazilian laws and shared nationalistic myths about the country's cosmopolitan potential. Such myths suggested that any difficulty of integration should be justified as resulting from a collective limitation of the ward and not of the state or nation. The resettlement agents often found such limitations in what they would call Palestinian culture, or also more commonly referred to the Arab culture in general, but also in the problematic condition of these undesirables, and usually in the confluence between these two factors. Authorities involved in the resettlement argued that since history had shown that everyone else integrated well in Brazil, the unruliness of the Palestinian group had to be attributed to their culture and problematic character. The latter characteristic was part of a narrative that had been transmitted from the UNHCR to the NGOs they hired in Brazil, and to the Brazilian government, which was aware that they were outcasts among undesirables. So the Brazilian official discourse about the refugees borrowed elements from the humanitarian vernacular, investing the government with morality, as it omitted the political character of the decision to receive the refugees, of the resettlement project, and of the actual legal and symbolic status bestowed upon the refugees vis-a-vis the Brazilian nation. Such supposedly apolitical morality, besides yielding corporality to the nation, in turn justifies a civilizatory mission, as stated by Sonia Hamid. As I found out, it is the civilizatory mission that motivates a priori the disposition and the disciplinary practices that the resettlement project's agents bring to bear upon the objects of tutelage. So the Croatian refugees resettled in Brazil were affected by scenarios as diverse as those of war-torn Iraq, the ideology of global humanitarianism, and Brazilian developmentalist policies. Legitimized through a tutelary regime, the resettlement agents reincorporated and in part unconsciously managed disciplinary practices upon the refugees. The shortcomings of humanitarian tutelage are hardly ever problematized beyond accepted consensus. In the case presented, tutelage assumed the refugees' temporary incapacity to govern their lives on their own, evoking the transference of biopower, or the power over subject lives, from the refugees to the UN and then to the Brazilian state. So tutelage was supposed to be transitory, ending upon complete integration. It was thus a counterpart to integration. While integration mobilized a medical ideological view of the host, in this case Brazilian nation, tutelage mobilized a bureaucratic regulatory apparatus in line with this view. So the medical ideological view of the Brazilian nation was based on the assumption that Brazil is a prejudice-free melting pot, evident especially by how all immigrants there had supposedly integrated to form one coherent Brazilian nation beyond ethnic, racial, religious, and cultural differences. As such, the Brazilian government expected the refugees would emulate the supposed behavior of the immigrants of the late 19th and 20th century, generational, contextual, and legal gaps notwithstanding. The conceptual place of the immigrant, and thus of the refugee, was in turn supported by heroic narratives and representations about the history of the immigrants in Brazil, upheld by the state as much as by the immigrants themselves and their descendants, Arabs included. Moreover, it was by dealing with undesirable refugees that the nation maintained its ideals about the Brazilian citizen. Failure to properly integrate was then to be solely attributed to the refugees themselves rather than to the resettlement program or any of its actors. Thus, when this refugees integration proved difficult, the rhetoric of the outcasts among the undesirables evoked stereotypes of the Palestinians as bellicose, unruly, and backward, this being the sole cause of the resettlement plan's failure. Neither the Brazilian government nor the UN and its NGOs acknowledge the contradiction between humanitarianism and the nation, which I suggest are tacit counterparts. Yet, the disciplinary practices of the resettlement project departed from representations of the Palestinian and especially the Brazilian nation, and about the place of the refugee in what Lisa Malki calls the national order of things. Thus, a humanitarian vernacular was embedded in the Brazilian rhetoric and policies towards the refugees, informing expectations about the refugees' so-called integration. Refugees, though, are not simply immigrants, yet, on the one hand, in the case presented here, they were expected to conform to an idealized view of those who left their countries voluntarily to live in Brazil many decades ago. And on the other hand, they were kept under tutelary control, their voices rarely heard. Rather than treating the refugees as active subjects to their own lives, the resettlement project muted the refugees' voices. While this paradox was illustrated by the Brazilian case, this is a much broader issue relating to the encounter between the national order of the world and humanitarianism at large. Thank you very much.
Leonardo, thanks so much for that. A very interesting presentation, the transition from Iraq to Brazil and all the intricacies of identity, citizenship. It's really sad. It's a pity that we will lose you because of the emergency. And we do really appreciate if you have a kind of a contact number that you can pop to everyone in case if they have a question like to interact and send their interjection with you. This would be amazing and lovely. And
Sure.
thanks for having you.
I mean, I can.
Please.
Sorry. I could still answer some questions if you want, but let me put here my generic email address.
That would be amazing. That would be very supportive.
And you can reach me, where you can reach me, and then we can talk more.
Yeah, that's great, Leonardo. Thanks so much for being here. And please, everyone, if you have any questions, the email that Leonardo just put down, it's his way of connecting with him over the ideas and insights that come across. Thanks so much for that. So really appreciate having you here. So we move to Roba Ali Al-Hassani. I did it right this time, so it's great. So here you go.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen for a moment. Well, not just for a moment. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's perfect. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so warning, a few of you may have seen some parts of this presentation because I'm repurposing some parts because there are 3 different research projects that are using similar methodology and are interconnected. So they're part of a portfolio project. That would explain any similarities from past presentations that I may have given. With that out of the way, I would like to begin with a quote about belonging. And it's by Brené Brown, who is a social scientist. She says that belonging is the innate human desire to be a part of something larger than us. Because this yearning is so primal, we often try to acquire it by fitting in and by seeking approval, which are not only hollow substitutes for belonging, but often barriers to it. Because true belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world, our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. And this is important in the context of Iraq today and the protest movements and this desire and need for belonging. In Iraq, springtime does not bring hope like the autumn does, for the spring and summer usually bring scorching heat and much anger due to the lack of electricity and air conditioning. And the autumn usually cools down public passions. However, in 2019, October witnessed a rise in public passions and public anger due to the status quo. And Iraqis went to the streets to fight for their rights, agency, and sense of belonging, all of which have been denied since the 2003 US-led invasion. Since 2003 and even before, the average Iraqi citizen has been going through a psychosocial war, often overlooked in public discourse, that aims to alienate, isolate, and weaken. Saddam Hussein instilled fear and distrust in Iraqis as he invested in state surveillance and forced people to spy on each other as they witnessed and suffered physical and cultural genocide. The war continued with the US-led invasion as the intention behind the state reconstruction that aimed to alienate the average Iraqi from political state structures, society, and one's own agency. When the US invaded Iraq, the plan was not to focus on post-conflict peace building and institution capacity building that would allow Iraqi self-determination. Instead, the invasion and intended reconstruction of Iraq were fueled by economic imperatives to make a profit regardless of consequence, reducing the Iraqi social and political to the market economy, which radically meant the production of a new social world. And I need to emphasize that the production of a new social world, state building quickly devolved to what seemed to be the intended disintegration and militarization of Iraqi state structures and society. And this militarization has led to a trickle-down effect to various aspects of Iraqi society, gender relations, family relations. There has been an increase in domestic violence. Unfortunately, a number of other aspects of society that militarization has directly impacted. With the establishment of consociational governance or muhassasa ta'ifiyya, ethno-sectarian discrimination became institutionalized policy. Relying on ethno-sectarian and party quota, the system boosts unelected politicians into power, denying the public their votes and disempowering them. While Iraqis feel unrepresented by the political process, minorities are especially alienated. Consociationalism enables and maintains corruption, and corruption deepens inequality as it relies on exploitation through mechanisms that allow a party to establish privilege and power through the hoarding of opportunities. Political corruption has left many Iraqis in poverty and without basic services, and it has denied them many opportunity. And it has increased various forms of extortion and exploitation, which again lead to social inequality and social issues. Now, prioritizing the American occupation and ensuing Iraqi governments established the extension of political power through various arms and apparatuses of the government, with the potential to contribute to political and social alienation. Education through academic institutions and the media would shape people's minds and ideologies. The law would shape people's behavior, and the military apparatus would police people's bodies. To ensure security and control, post-2003 Iraqi administrations have prioritized political power and oil market profits, as well as created public mistrust of government power. At the foundation of each state-society relation is a system designed to keep the people alienated politically and socially. And they feel especially so in the middle of a regional proxy war, where the US and Iran fight over who has authority and legitimacy in Iraq. There's a resistance that claims to have legitimacy fighting the US presence, and there's US presence that claims legitimacy fighting Iranian presence. So one validates the other on Iraqi soil, and in the middle of all this, Iraqis are wondering, where are we left? And I do explore this in many of my projects, how Iraqis believe that they are central to state sovereignty, which they really are, but they're often taken out of the equation and overlooked. And there's this particular image that has stayed in my mind where Iraqis feel invisible and they want to be heard, and they feel that completely alienated from everything around them, from the state, from state institutions, from each other, and from the international community, where no one will look at them unless they are a barrel of oil. And this is why I focus a lot on alienation and alienation theory and on emotions while exploring Iraqi contemporary topics. I refuse to look at things purely through a political lens, though the political is personal and the personal is political. But particularly the October Tishrin Revolution is a culmination of emotions that emerge from structural issues that I have discussed. And as Theodore Kemper says, although movements take their place in history by what they do on the stage of history, internally they are often cauldrons of emotion at the boil. Important cues to these internal conflicts and struggles for ascendancy are the relational patterns prevailing between standard categories in society, age, gender, class, race, occupation, and so on. Generational differences are particularly critical since they often represent differences in degree of adaptation to the very conditions that the movement intends to change. And the emerging slogan from the protest movement, Nrid Watan, or we want a homeland, is particularly telling, and it invites inquiry into the movement's relationship with identity, belonging, citizenry, and sovereignty. The slogan on its own has been mistranslated and misinterpreted by many as we want a country, but that's not what homeland really means. Homeland is not a place of residence, it is a place of belonging. And this has resonated in many of the chants and the videos that emerged from the protest movement, where there was this growing sense of solidarity. And it was not just a matter of corruption. In my different research projects, I explore how this protest movement is more social than political, and how it has produced a shift, a cultural shift in the collective consciousness of society. And while the main target of protests is the corrupt political system, it has impacted many aspects of society in a very paternal, patriarchal way, and the various dynamics in society. So the protest movement is so much more than just politics. It's about generational shifts and generational dynamics. For example, in this image, there are two elderly men who are thanking youth for waking them up from hibernation and shattering the barrier of silence that they have been in for so long. And because of all this emotion in the protest movement, I emphasize again the need to examine things from a sociology of emotion perspective, whether structural or cultural, etc. And the protesters and activists have been very creative in how they approach matters, and they invite creativity from us as researchers as well. So, for example, they use a lot of internet, a lot of social media in their mobilization, in their activism, in their storytelling. One prominent hashtag was Man Qatalani, asking who killed me. And here we see the images of Riham Yaqub, Tahsin Usama, Husham al-Hashimi, Ihab al-Wazni, and many others who have been assassinated over the past 2 years. And this End Impunity campaign has been calling for accountability for those assassinating activists and protesters. And because they're engaging in the storytelling, I explore social media, social networking sites as a research method, not just a platform. Why? Because technology is the campfire around which we tell our stories. Protesters were particularly angry when Adel Abdel Mahdi's government enforced an internet blackout in the early days of protest, because he was trying to silence them, and their type of storytelling that was being done online was suddenly blocked out. The listener, the audience, was no longer there all of a sudden. It was just them telling a story and no one hearing it. And so they used very creative means to reach the international community and tell their stories. And there was, of course, great pressure, and that government is gone, and the internet is back. And there are still many issues that Iraqi society is dealing with, but Iraqis have gone from a black box society during Saddam's time, isolated from the world, no satellite, no internet, and now there's everything. But there's still a consistent effort to silence protesters, but the internet has been a place of public discourse, for better or for worse. And I say that because militias have been using social networking sites to issue public death threats, and revealing a culture of impunity. They have been using social media to recruit, to spread hate speech. So social networking sites have been used for better or for worse, but either way, I use them as a research methodology for digital ethnography in particular. And I'm very wary of my positionality as an Iraqi who does support the protest movement. Sometimes I do participate, but for much of the time I have to remind myself to be a lurking observer who just logs on and just scrolls through and watches and takes notes of how the discourse around identity, around belonging, around sovereignty are all evolving over time. Since society is fluid, these notions are fluidly evolving as well. And so ethnography is important, where it provides an alternative to studying each of the online and the offline separately. It connects both, where there's a society on the ground and there's a parallel virtual one on the internet, and connecting both and seeing how both help evolve this fluid notion of sovereignty, of identity and belonging. For example, although I'm not completely done this research project, it's a work in progress, I'm noticing that identity is becoming very different to many youth. They are challenging social norms, conventional norms, and conventional labels and identities. And identity is becoming something very different. And I think over time, we are about to witness something that's not only far from sectarian identity an ethnic identity, but it's something far different, because it has been years since youth have begun arguing, let's stop using surnames altogether, because by asking someone about their surname, you can tell what their denomination is, which part of the country they're from, and so much more. And that was years ago, but now this has been coming for quite some time. And I did expect this protest movement to take place. 2 years ago, or over 2 years ago, 2018 maybe, I was at a workshop and we were all asked whether we were pessimistic or optimistic about Iraq. And I was the only optimistic one at the time. They said, why? And I said, I have faith in the youth. Something's about to happen. And indeed, the protest movement did happen. And it's not about being right or wrong, but about paying attention to what's happening on the ground and to the fluid changes that are taking place. And one of the fluid changes is a change in feelings of belonging, identities that are being challenged and reshaped entirely. And I look forward to everyone's feedback. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roba. Really appreciate Rashid Butayeb. Thanks so much for your patience. I do really appreciate it. I can see that program you were first on the list, so please accept my apology for that. It's blame is mine. The mishap is coming from my side, and thanks for your patience that we reorder that. It's please, the floor is yours, and I promise I will never interrupt you until you finish. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Salam everyone, and many thanks for the invitation. For reasons of time, I will focus in my presentation on the problematic relationship between patriotism and citizenship in the Arab context. What I call unfinished citizenship is related to this inconsistency and contradiction between patriotism and citizenship in the Arab world. Patriotism often requires us to have an unconditional affiliation to the homeland, which is a collective one that always sacrifices the individual and the different, the other, while citizenship contrasts with an open affiliation based on rights and duties, a cold affiliation in the positive sense of the word, as we meet with philosophers such as the German Helmut Plessner or the Austrian Karl Popper. We can speak of patriotism in the Arab context only as the antithesis of this cold affiliation. It is based, as the Lebanese thinker Nassif Nassar describes it, on love, and love too can be deadly, as the saying goes. In other words, the logic that governs patriotism is similar to the logic of the community and not the society, if we recall the distinction made by Ferdinand Tönnies. It is the logic of kinship, affection, and belonging. Nassif Nassar is right when he understands citizenship as a complex phenomenon, but its center is the individual insofar as he is a participating member in the national community and in the state, subject to a specific system of rights and duties. In the same context, Nassar differentiates between a citizen and a believer. Through this differentiation, he understands faith as a personal, subjective experience and not as a collective experience, political affiliation, or total membership. He also writes, the citizen is not in his essence the believer, and the people are not in their essence the group of believers. Distinguishing the citizen from the believer, or stripping his flesh from the flesh of the religious truth, he binds him to a legal membership based on freedom and equality before the law. To this legal membership belongs the right to monitor and hold rulers accountable, which is what we lack in the patriotism that prevails in the Arab context. Yes, it is a patriotism without citizenship. And this is illustrated by Nassar's criticism of the sectarian system in Lebanon, which, in his opinion, is based on the dualism of affiliation and sectarian quotas, which hinders the achievement of full citizenship. That is why Nassif Nassar is right in his criticism of Charles Malik, who continued to consider that the citizen in Lebanon is linked to his religious or sectarian identity, and when he considers that the state is just an institution between institutions and does not have any preference over other sectarian institutions. Nassif Nassar sees this duality of belonging as a reason for the conflict within the state between nationalism and sectarianism, and it is one of the main reasons behind the continued failure of the Lebanese state. But this conflict between liberal patriotism and sectarianism is not confined to Lebanon or the Arab Mashriq, but is also part of the political reality in North Africa. Yes, we cannot talk about sectarianism in this context, but we will talk about traditionalism, a conflict between modernity and tradition, or the continuation of tradition within modernity in a way that extends the life of authoritarianism and impedes the achievement of full citizenship. The only guarantee for the continuation of the democratic system lies in the citizenship, not in patriotism. The Germans in the Nazi era were patriots, and they not only loved their homeland, but also deified him. This can be said of all the totalitarianism that demand unconditional love, a love that often takes on pathological dimensions, which may sacrifice the homeland, the moral, the human life, and even the most intimate kinship relations in the name of the patriotism. Freeing politics from emotions or freeing it from love is a condition of each democracy able to learn from its mistakes. Such democracy must be understood as establishing the values of freedom and not the values of sacrifice, or in the language of Jacques Derrida's, of fraternocracy. The crux of the matter in this, the idea of sacrifice for the sake of a homeland or an ideal or an idea is against the individual and its freedom, and it is against citizenship and its secular spirit. It is an illiberal idea and may sometimes border on fascism. The possibility of belonging to more than one country goes beyond narrow patriotism and closed affiliation to a culture or ethnicity or religion. Just as we should not mix the citizen and the believer, according to Nassif Nassar, we should not, in my opinion, mix the citizen and the patriot, for then we will empty citizenship from its critical dimension. And if we want to sum it up in the constructive language, I only have one homeland, but it's not mine. But despite the bloody history of patriotism and nationalism, there are still philosophers who defend patriotism and link morality and community, and even believe that one can only be moral within a particular community. For these philosophers, including McIntyre, it is not possible to speak of a universal a priori or transcendental morality in Kantian sense, since there is no preconceived categorical imperative of community. As convincing as this idea seems, the more it presents us with a lot of problems, for it is in its mixing of Moralität and Sittlichkeit always means sacrificing one for the other. Hegel's separation of the two spheres, like McIntyre's mixing of the two, does not solve the problem. In a letter to one of his friends, Nietzsche will express his desire to live among the Mohammedans to form an objective judgment of Europe. Nietzsche is not only offering us a lesson in interculturality here, but rather expressing the external identity of critique. What I am saying is that the real test of the universality of Western thought, its morality and its way of life, is to be sought in another reality than its own in which it appeared. It does not mean subjecting them to another Weltsicht or testing them by a morality other than one's own, or sacrificing universality for the sake of particularism. That would be like coming out of the frying pan into the fire. And to make it clear, if we take patriotism as an example, we are made aware of the limits and even the dangers of communal thinking. Patriotism in a context like the Arab one tends to be recognized as a political pathology rather than as a fundamental virtue, as McIntyre, for example, understands it. The liberal objection to the communitarianism is of great importance, especially if we view it through a context such as the Arab one. Universal morality remains the only guarantee against the status quo of the political system, and it is the basis of all criticism that we can direct to this status quo. McIntyre connects the moral and political identity of patriotism to the past and to a particular vision of that past. He brings the past into the present and returns the present to the past And in doing so, he thinks patriotism through identity rather than through critique of identity, as, for example, the constitutional patriotism does. Even when he speaks of the future, it is rather a future's past, because the future project of the nation draws its identity from the past. What will a Syrian, Iraqi, or Afghan refugee say about patriotism and homeland? Patriotism has lost all credibility in a context like the Arab one, where it has turned into an immoral justification for dictatorship and authoritarianism. And if we wanted to express this in a language close to that of Claude Lefort, we would write that patriotism fears the emptiness, while emptiness remains the condition for democracy. In his critical discussion of the McIntyre understanding of patriotism, Polycarp Ekionob comes to the following conclusion. Patriotism is often used to engender blind and mindless loyalty and to prevent constructive participation in political affairs and the critical and rational examination of policies. And if we judge so harshly an issue related to the American context, namely the Iraqi war protesters in the US, how should we judge the bloody events that occur in the name of patriotism in the Arab world? Thank you for your attention.
Rashid, thanks so much for that. What an interesting insight into the interjections and interactions between patriotism and citizenship and the dangerous risks coming along with that. Finally, Luciano Zakara, assistant professor at the Qatar University, and Salem Urab, teaching assistant at the same university. It's great that Luciano will do the presentations, and when it comes to the Q&A, Salem kindly and graciously enough will be available as well for the chat to answer any questions related to the presentation. The floor is yours, Luciano, and thanks for being here.
Thank you very much to all of you for being here and for organizing this wonderful conference. Let me share my presentation. Can you see that? Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So this is the preliminary title. We don't know if we're going to change the title according to the content of the paper, the challenges and opportunities of the first Shura Council elections in Qatar, which is a research we have been doing with Salem in Qatar, of the elections that took place on the 2nd of October this year, the first Shura election councils in Qatar. This is the outline of the paper that we are preparing, in which we discuss a legal framework of the Shura Council elections, the electoral precedents that were represented by the Central Municipal Council elections that started in 1999, the electoral process itself, the results on the Shura Council composition, the assessment of the electoral process itself, and then the conclusions. So very briefly, what I want to introduce on this research, which were the questions that they drove our research. We wanted to reply 3 main questions that they called our attention: is if the inclusion of all citizens, Qatari citizens, was guaranteed along the process. Second, if the tribal, the electoral system selected for these elections reinforced or isn't reinforcing the tribalism or tribal mechanisms of representation, and if this new elected Shura Council and the elections themselves contributed to increase government accountability and transparency, and it will be in the future. The main objective of this research actually to assess on whether this process represents a change in the political process in terms of decision-making process, and in terms of citizens' representation in this political process and inclusion within the policy-making process. The main argument that we are trying to conclude along this presentation is that while representing a first and very important step towards citizens' inclusion into the political process, there are still a very limited results in terms of political reform, political representation, and mainly transparency and accountability. And the assessment criteria for the electoral process itself, that we select this set of criteria composed of 6 elements, which is participation, competition, transparency, representation and debate, openness, and relevance. Of course, in the article, we define what each of them mean, and we try to assess at the end of the paper the whole electoral process before reaching the conclusions. So the first section of this paper is related to the legal framework of the electoral of the Shura Council election, that is represented by 3 main elements, which is the Qatar Constitution of 2003, which Article 76 and 77 define the composition and the attributions of the elected Shura Council. The second element is Nationality Law 38 of 2005, which is the reform law of 1961, which defines 2 things. First, who is Qatari, setting the 1930 as a date that is considered the landmark to define who is Qatari and who is not. And second, in the Article 16, the differences between original and naturalized citizens in terms of electoral rights and political rights. Which actually became the most controversial aspect of this nationality law that surfaced during these elections. And the third element is the Shura Council Electoral Law of July number 7, that defined who can vote, moving the criteria towards those Qatari which grandfathers were Qatari and born in Qatar, so changing that eligibility criteria of the nationality law, and the Article 4 that defined the virtual district distribution along historical tribal lines. These were the 2 main elements that actually, at the end of the day, were part of the whole debate before, during, and after the elections. The electoral presence, very briefly, I mentioned two things about these elections. First, that the municipal council, the Central Municipal Council, was until now the only Qatari elective institution that started to be voted in 1999. That the districts were defined geographically on the basis of the number of eligible voters residing in one place, totally different from what it happened now. One important thing to point out is that all Qatari citizens were able to vote, regardless of the regulations set on the nationality law of 2005. We have to say that in 2014 there was a reform on the electoral districts that they would show supposedly why this happened. And things we can say is that there was a very limited citizen engagement due to the very limited attributions granted to the elected municipal council. This is what I tried to say before, that this is the allocation of tribes or the seats distributed among the most popular tribes in the 6 electoral processes in Qatar. And we can see that, for instance, the Al Marri tribe got 8 seats in 2011, and after that there was a gerrymandering process that reduced the Al Marri tribe share in the municipal council to 5 and 4, which some people argue that this is the main reason why the district allocation in this Shura Council election was not based on geography or geographical boundaries, but on virtual place of residents of historic tribes. Sorry about people passing by behind. And this is very basic figures about the participation. As I mentioned before, very reduced participation. We are talking about a figure of 333,000 Qataris, supposedly according to unofficial figures published by the press during this electoral process. And we see that the participation of the people registered in the elections, in the municipal ones, never reached, barely reached 32,000 in 2011. So we are talking about very reduced amount of people voting, with a participation rate based on registered voters even lower, 50% of the people voted in 2009, meaning that 18,000 people voted. This is not the case of the Shura Council, which is supposed to have had much more participation, even though we don't have the figures. So the electoral process itself, the elections took place on the 2nd of October. The voter registration started on the 1st of August. And after a period of appeal, finally, the citizens either received an SMS saying that they were registered with the district allocated, or they didn't receive any message, and they had neither after appealing. Up to date, no official information of voter register and accepted was released by the government, so we don't know official figures about voter registration or actually how many people voted in absolute numbers. There were many controversies, many who did not receive the SMS after applying for registration, many from many tribal backgrounds, mainly from Al-Marri tribe. Renowned people like Sheikha Al-Shufari did not receive, and she was not belonging to that tribe. There were some detentions, some of them still are detained, or we don't know if they were released, like Dr. Hassa Al-Marri, which was the most prominent one that was detained. And there were also controversies with the district allocation. Shias or people with Shia background was allocated in one single district, certain with slave background in one single district, etc., etc. I mean, there are many things that they were mentioned by many people that we got the chance to interview. As I said, there are no official figures, but however, we have some official figures, for instance, that they claim that around 80,000 people were registered, that 18 did not receive the message, and then only 30% of those were approved after the appeal. In the paper, we share some of the data, but I will not discuss them here. Regarding the candidates, the registration started on the 22nd without even knowing how many voters were. Unofficial figures say that 400 people registered, and the final list of candidates published by the government, by the Ministry of Interior, was 228, including 208 men and 20 women. However, there were many rumors about many candidates that were forced to drop or were deleted from the list before the elections. And we know that many dropped, but were still visible as candidates at the polling station, so they didn't have enough time to delete their names from the ballot papers or from the screens that they were showing in the polling station, which could drive to some issues regarding transparency or accuracy of the information provided in the polling stations. From the district distribution and the candidates that we could find distributed along the different districts, we can make some basic conclusions about how the districts were divided and how the families or the different tribes were allocated or were distributed among the 30 districts that they were allocated seats to be elected. Many districts included only one big tribe. This drove for competition within the tribe. So the main trend was competition within the tribe, which drove to two main features. First, a single or very few candidates figures competed for the seat, like for instance in Farij al-Hulaifat, or Farij al-Ghanim, or al-Haraytiyat, in which we had one or two candidates at maximum, or districts in which there were multiple candidates that competed for a seat from the same family, from Al-Kuwari, for instance, 18, Al-Kuwaisi, 9, or Al-Hashri, 9, in districts that they were absolutely one big tribe or one big tribe with other minor tribes that they were in the same districts. And on the other hand, there were many districts that included, I mean, this case of the single tribe district, it was the most common along the 30 districts. However, there are many districts that included many small tribes, which drove to, first of all, competition within, between tribes for a seat, that you can find one or many candidates representing each tribe. For instance, I took only two examples because there are many. For instance, in Al Jasra district, you could see 30 candidates from at least 10 different tribes. In Raudat Al Hail, 10 candidates representing 10 different families. So in this case, it's only the bigger tribe was able to win, or the one who was able to convince others, other tribes to transfer their votes to them. So there are different patterns along this that we could observe, and not one single pattern that governs all the electoral process in Qatar. The results, official figures, the only official figures published was that there was 63.5% turnout on registered voters, but we don't know in how many people was registered. No woman was elected, expected due to the district distribution. No official figures, as I said, and some official figures were released by some newspaper or distributed by WhatsApp. We tried to collect most of them, or at least some of them. These are some figures that I'm not going to discuss, but this is what you could see in terms of participation, in terms of how many votes were given to different candidates. The resulting composition of the Shura Council shows that most of the 30 elected members had already passed on governmental positions. 3 were previous ministers, 3 were previous Shura Council members, 2 were previous municipal council members, 2 diplomats, public prosecutors, 4 participated in writing the Constitution of 2003, 2 were from the same tribe, from Al-Madid, and some cases in which, for instance, in Al-Najada tribe, no Al-Najada member won, but someone that belonged to a non-Najdi tribe. But most of them, the most interesting is that most of them, they had a past belonging to high level of governmental position. And the composition of the Shura Council, 30 were elected, the other 15 were appointed. And the appointment of the other 15 was more or less confirming some of the things that they were said before the elections, that, for instance, some families like Al-Madid, Al-Hashri, or Muhanadi will have more representatives because they were more important in terms of power sharing within the Qatari structure. And for instance, there was a second candidate from Al-Marri, having in mind that the pre-electoral process was controversial due to the complaint expressed by members from that tribe. Regarding the assessment of the electoral process itself, if we go through these 6 criteria we set, in the paper we're going more into detail about that, but regarding participation, we have to say that the controversy created by the 2005 and 2021 laws was the main element of criticism in terms of participation, and that they drove the main problem in terms of reduced participation or limited participation to certain groups of people. In terms of competition, it was limited in some districts due to the tribal pre-electoral arrangements and district distribution, so it was predetermined limited competition, because the way that the government decided to go for this electoral representation mechanism, transparency, there were efficiencies along the registration process and the results publication. So far, results were not published and will not be published, and along the whole process, there was kind of lack of transparency about, visible in the whole process, that it was also reported by most of the people we interviewed. In terms of representation and debate, there was limited, the representation was limited to tribal representatives, since no parties or other cleavages were able to be visible in the elections, and there was basically no debate in the campaign. Only candidates were able to present their names or some ideas in the specific time dedicated in Qatar television. In terms of openness, results were very predictable due to the district distribution and voter registration and voter voting patterns that actually predicted the results without almost no surprise, and without many changes visible as a resulting composition of the elected Shura Council, which is the last point, the relevance. There was basically no change in the composition, nor compared with previous, the pre-electoral process, Shura Council. and no drastic increase in Shura Council attribution is expected, at least in this term, in terms of policy making, in terms of oversight and control of the executive power. So to go quickly to the conclusions, undoubtedly this was a first and very important step towards citizens' inclusion in the political process. This is something that we can't deny, and of course it increased the political culture of Qatari citizens and introduced many Qataris into the political debate, or at least political arena and electoral participation, electoral issues. However, replying the three questions that we mentioned at the beginning, if the inclusion of all citizens was guaranteed, we can say that although it is based on legal consideration and the legal framework that we mentioned before, the reply is that not all citizens were allowed to vote, at least not all Qatari citizens that expressed their willingness to vote were able to do so due to different reasons. And that there was a clear discrimination based on origin. First of all, date of arrival to the country, according to the constitution, related to the religious sect, as we mentioned, Shias were put in some place, or blood purity. So there were some discrimination legally established by different norms and regulations, but however, they do represent some kind of discrimination. Regarding the second question, is the electoral system reinforcing tribalism? Tribalism as a mechanism of political representation has been actually reinforced due to the district distribution and the limitation chosen by the government, which had the most important side effect that no female representation was achieved due to this tribal mechanism. In terms of composition, the same composition in terms of tribe that previous appointed Shura Council was both visible, both compared with the appointed Shura Council of 2017 and beforehand, and including a comparison with the historical distribution of tribes from the 1930s based on documents from the British Foreign Office that was mapping the distribution of tribes existing in Qatar. So basically, what the elections did is, instead of changing the map of the representation, was just to reinforce the representation that already existed in terms of tribe, but allowing every tribe to choose their own representative to the council. And of course, the most powerful tribe, like Al-Hashri, Al-Madid, linked to the Al-Thani, had more representatives. Al-Thani did not participate in the election. Of course, they are not allowed to participate. They are allowed to vote, but they are not allowed to run, and they don't participate in one single district. They are distributed along the whole country. Al-Marri tribes, or members of the Al-Marri tribe, were not satisfied, but the protest did not move forward. And some other families were not included due to the characteristic of the system. It was clear that not all the tribes could be included. And actually, what we can conclude is that these results reflect the current tribal power share within Qatar. So it did not produce any change in the composition of the Shura Council. And finally, is the Shura Council increasing government accountability and transparency? Unfortunately, this is one of the worst aspects of these elections. There was a lack of transparency along the whole process from authorities. There was also lack of interest from candidates and Shura Council members to speak when they were asked to do so, or they were requested. At least this is the experience we had. They were very reluctant in talking and sharing opinions or being cited in any public statement or any article. In terms of attributions in foreign policy, security of defense, we know that the Shura Council will be very limited or no attribution. And people that they were able to give us their opinion, they said that they did not expect to perform at full capacity, at least in this first legislative period. everybody was citing that this is a trial and error process, that they will expect in the next term to perform in a different way. And also, there are some rumors, and there have been many rumors about the changes on the electoral law as well as on the citizenship law to address the main concerns that this electoral process raised. This was addressed also by the Sheikh Tamim when they opened the session of the Shura Council, in which he mentioned specifically that this issue, the citizenship law, will be discussed eventually in the future. And this is everything I wanted to say. We leave the floor for question and answer if someone is interested. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Luciano. Very fresh and topical data, insider's perspective with a great mix of qualitative and quantitative analysts. So now the floor is open for all questions and answers coming across. So please, everyone, if you have any question, it would be great not to do that on the chat box in case it would slip into the net. So please feel free to put them in the Q&A section. And I can see two questions. One for Roba and another one for Luciano. Of course, Abdullah is here to answer with that as well. So the one on Roba, I'm sure that you can see it, but if in case not everyone is seeing it, thank you so much for your paper, Roba. Can you reflect on the place of Sunni majority areas formerly held by ISIS in the Tishreen movement? How did they fit into this new homeland notion? I understand the physical protest hasn't happened. Due to exhaustion, militia presence are not wanting to legitimize the Tishreen movement by any possible association with ISIS or Ba'athist or any negative terms. But have the Sunnis there showed solidarity through social media, for example? And there is a question from Drury. Can Luciano please comment on the non-participation by members of the electorate for political reasons? For example, former Attorney General and lawyer Najib al-Naimi told me that he never got the SMS while his daughter did, so effectively not included, and for political personal reasons. What about others, or is that possible to find? And I have using my position, I have a question for Rashid. Thanks for this great, I've never thought of this kind of bifurcation or the division between patriotism and citizenship. And I'm wondering, just shall we differentiate between the mundane cases of this division between citizenship and patriotism and moments of national crisis? In another way, if there's a national crisis, would the two terms overlap in a way that we cannot differentiate? This is my first question to you. Secondly, if someone is coming from the agnostic position of not knowing that much about the differences between them, if there's any specific book that you would recommend as a kind of a start into this kind of understanding the dynamics of both patriotism vis-a-vis citizenship as well, that would be great if you have any recommendation, especially that we just junior scholars, PhD students, master students are here as well. So thank you so much. The floor is yours. So we can start with Ruba, and then Luciano and Salim, and then Rashid, based on the order of questions coming across.
Thank you for the question. It's a good and interesting question at the same time, because so many people are inclined to look at things from a sectarian lens. And I mean, here we are at a conference that discusses sectarianism and anti-sectarianism. The protest movement in Iraq used a lot of hashtags and slogans that were not particularly affiliated with any particular identity. So there was no sectarian alignment to anything that was chanted during the protests, which made it very easy for people of diverse backgrounds in Iraq to support the protest movement or be part of it. And based on data that has been collected since the protests began, there are a great many people in Iraq who did not participate in the protests, but who supported strongly. And among those people are a lot of Sunnis. So the protest movement, as many people know, emerged largely in Shia majority parts of the country, the center and the south. In the western provinces or governorates like Anbar, there activists wanted to join the protest movement, and there was social media engagement. There were some posts. But what we've noticed is that there was this immediate response from security forces, local security forces and local government to silence them right away. And there were raids, midnight raids at the houses of activists who did post anything online in support of the protest movement, by merely saying in Reed Watan, we want a homeland, or by merely saying Nazal Akh Haqqi, which means I'm going out to take back my rights. Just posting those words has gotten people arrested. In Anbar, in Tikrit. Tikrit University actually witnessed attempts for protest, but campus security and police showed up and tried to silence protesters. So there was certainly interest from activists and people in these parts of the country to join the protests, but these attempts were quickly silenced. Other than that, in the Kurdish region, there were protests as well. Not at first, but the protests in the Kurdish region have come in waves, and they have been facing violent crackdown as well from local government. Sorry, I'm escaping the sun that's in my face. But anyway, the Kurdish movement is not to be divorced from the national movement, the Tishreen movement, but at the same time, we shouldn't hide it or push it under that same rug, because there are some distinctions. People in the Kurdish region have been protesting against their local government, not the federal government. And they've been doing that for years. But after seeing the Tishreen movement, at first many were quiet, but then afterwards, many began to support as well online. And eventually they began to organize on the ground and going out in protests. Usually those who protest in the Kurdish region are teachers, public employees who have not been getting their salaries for months. This has been the case for years. Over the past 2 years, more and more activists have been going out in the Kurdish region. The latest wave has been of university students, and each and every time they face violent crackdown from their local government. And interestingly, in the Kurdish context, you will find activists who offer solidarity and accept solidarity from the rest of Iraq. And then there are a few who maintain Kurdish nationalism. Mind you, when I see that online, I see that more from Kurds outside Iraq, outside the Kurdish region, in the diaspora. They're the ones with the stronger national inclinations, whereas those in the Kurdish region are more concerned about the existing systemic problems that they face directly, firsthand, whereas people in the diaspora don't face it anywhere as directly. So you'll find more solidarity within people in Iraq than maybe from some people in the diaspora. Mind you, the Tishreen movement has gained widespread support from people in the diaspora in North America, in the UK, and other parts of the world. But I would, when it comes to nationhood or our homeland, the definitions might vary for Assyrians, for example, for Kurds, for Arabs, and I would not want to paint them all with one paintbrush. And like I said, Kurdish voices are not a monolith. Arab voices are not a monolith. Assyrian voices are not a monolith. There are differences between, individuals in each of these ethno-confessional backgrounds. And you will find some Assyrians in the diaspora who support the Tishreen movement, but at the same time will ask, where's the support for us? And this is why there are there are youth and people in the Tashreen movement who are growing to listen more to these pockets of the population. And Harakat Imtidad, a new political party in Iraq, and Al-Bayt al-Watani, these are new emergent parties and political bodies from the Tashreen movement, and they're embracing and inviting more people from minoritized backgrounds to join them. So Al-Bayt al-Watani has Yazidi members, it has Kurdish members, and Imtidad this week formed an official opposition. For the first time, Iraq has a political opposition in decades, and it involves the new generation, which is a Kurdish party as well as Imtidad from the Tashreen movement. So there are different notions of homeland, but there are also different notions of identity and political formation that are all emerging from the Tashreen movement. I hope I answered the question, although I went on for a while.
Thanks so much for that. Please, the chairman and Salim, then Rashid, please.
Okay, thank you, Drery, for your question. Yeah, I mean, I will reply briefly, and then Salim will elaborate a little bit more. We know that there are people that, not because of legal reasons, we know families that there were 7 brothers and 6 brothers were approved, and the last one was not approved. And this last one, for instance, was someone that was planning to run. So the problem is we don't have evidence, enough evidence to prove that. So we will mention some things on the paper, but we cannot specifically write names or anything, because these people neither wanted to do it public. In this case that you mentioned, could be because of the rule that is applicable, is that your grandfather should be Qatari. So probably Najib al-Nuaimi, his grandfather was not Qatari, but his father was. So his daughter, of course, has his grandfather Qatari. So this happened in many families. But indeed, there were people that they were not able to run or to vote because of these reasons. Sheikh al-Jufari, for instance, she didn't receive a text message, meaning that she was not accepted in the first term. She appealed and she got accepted. But once you are rejected in the first application, you cannot run. So this was a way also to reduce candidates that they were willing to run, because we interviewed Sheikha, she expressed her willingness to run as a candidate. But this way they reduced the capacity of this people to run. However, Sheikha was appointed at the Shura Council. So many things happen, but since we don't have clear evidence that this was the reason of this happening, it's very difficult to conclude that this was part of an official policy. But Salim, I think, has more things to say about it. Your mic is muted.
Sorry, I think that you are muted. Yeah.
You have mic? Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So we don't actually know how many people did not get SMSs, but from what we saw on Twitter and other videos circulated, it is too many to ignore. As for Najib al-Nuaimi, I mean, I would personally love to meet him to know additional information. Personally speaking, I had the chance to know many cousins who did not initially get SMS as eligible voters. Eventually, they appealed and they got their eligibility. However, under certain circumstances, some people, I mean, I personally know a couple of them, they appealed and they waited and still they got nothing. According to some sources that we have met, when they did the legal procedures, some of the people who did not get the SMS in the first phase, around tens of thousands got, but we have to be kind of specific on the concrete figures. But like according to one lawyer we have met, there are like around 18 to 20,000 Qataris who got their eligibility after they appealed. I am sure there are too many who got their eligibility afterwards, but we don't know how many exactly, because unfortunately we still suffer due to the lack of transparency in the results and the election figures. So this is briefly touches on the aspect of Najib al-Naimi. I hope this answered this question. If it's
I think we lost the moderator.
Really? Okay.
Yes, I think Mustafa may have gotten disconnected.
Yeah, it seems that Rashid now is the host of the meeting. So Rashid, you want to you want to coordinate the panel?
I don't mind doing it since I'm from CPAD. So
okay, Ruba, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
No worries. So there's a question for Luciano and Salim.
Yeah, is it the Nasib or?
Yes. So has Shura elections enhanced or undermined the notion of national unity, national identity that especially gained importance after 2017 Qatar blockade?
Yeah, okay. Okay, I'll begin with this answer. Unfortunately, yes, many Qataris who did not receive SMS began questioning their identity. Questions like, if I am not able to express my political views and choose my representatives, on what grounds I am a Qatari? So some people on at the end of the spectrum, they went a bit extreme and considered leaving the country, similar to what some Kuwaitis did when they clashed with the government on corruptions and other cases. If the blockade in 2017, the blockade succeeded in uniting the Qataris, elections have done the opposite. The Shura Council elections have done the opposite. When many Qataris expressed their anger on not receiving SMS, some other Qataris reacted by questioning the first group's loyalty. So basically, if you express your grievances for not receiving SMS, you are accused of harming the state and putting your loyalty into a question. So unfortunately, if the intention of the government for initiating the Shura Council elections to unite the Qataris and to make them express their political views peacefully, what we have seen did the opposite due to the exclusion of many Qataris for not receiving SMS. So this is my clear answer to the question.
Thank you. There's another question, and this one's for Rashid. You spoke about the patriotism and citizenship dynamic, but there seems to be a dramatic and concerning conflation between patriotism and nationalism. Can you speak more about why this conflation is strong in the region, in some places more than others, of course? Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting question. Yes, I can give you maybe a good example from modern Arab history. After the 6 Days War, that is in the time of a great national crisis, the Egyptians decided for patriotism. It means for Jamal Abdel Nasser and not for the citizenship, for a critical attitude towards Arab nationalism. We see today the consequences of such decision today. I can say the same also about the dispute today between the Moroccan and Algerian regimes. Both regimes demand unconditional patriotism and thereby sacrifice the values of citizenship. Patriotism is, in my opinion, a narrow-mindedness that works against democratic culture, not only in an authoritarian context like the Arab one, but also in a democratic context. I'm thinking here about the populist governments in the Eastern Europe that today propagate patriotism at the expense of citizenship. Yes, more can I not say.
Thank you for that. There's another question that asks about Qatar. It remains the case that some 2,000 more or less ex-Qatari citizens remain in Saudi. Has deprivation of citizenship ever come up in the election period?
Okay, I can go for that question.
Yeah.
Okay. I believe that some Qataris, when they realize that they could not vote, they say, okay, if we remain silent and did not demonstrate our anger or our grievances, we might have faced the fate of those ex-Qatari citizens. So yes, it came up, but it was not the main case or the main issue that touches upon